General, part of the deal includes the U.S. leading an international economic effort to try and prevent Iran and Hezbollah from doing the reconstruction. How important is it to try and prevent Iran from stepping back in? And then, General, also just the responsibility that the Lebanese army is going to have on this. It's not a very, as Hala was saying, not a very strong armed forces.
Yeah, you're quite right. Look, at the end of the day, this is a reality of the battlefield. Diplomacy ratifies the outcomes that are actually occurring in war. And the Hezbollah has been devastated, starting with the loss of much of their chain of command, with the explosion of these, devices throughout Lebanon. And now we've seen incredibly effective Israeli intelligence that has allowed their Air Force to devastate not just the units, a 100,000-man fighting force, but also their missile stocks. So it's very good news. The Israelis have taken significant casualties. As you discussed already, there are 1 million Lebanese who are refugees and 80,000 some odd Israelis, so this will be well received. I've also been watching casualties on Israeli TV and newspapers, and they've taken some really significant losses, both in Gaza and also in southern Lebanon. So it's good news, and we ought to take into account also the fact there's a Trump bow wave in all of this. His support for Israel has been publicly unyielding. And so Hezbollah, I think, decided we better get aboard here before the new administration takes office.
General, and you were talking about those pagers, beepers, walkie-talkie attacks. They're really devastating. It was devastating to the entire Hezbollah infrastructure. I'm just wondering, the Hezbollah of today is a different Hezbollah than it was just a year ago, and certainly over the years when we remember, I remember going from Beirut to Baalbek and the stops that one had to make along the way because Hezbollah had road checkpoints. It's a different Hezbollah today?
Yeah, well, it's been well equipped by the Iranians and others. It has very modern anti-tank weapons, pretty decent ability to attack Israel with missiles and drones. Throughout this conflict, by the way, it's really discussed. Yesterday, I think there were well over 100 Hezbollah missiles fired at Israel. So they were deemed to be an impressive fighting force, bringing in even greater recognition, the effectiveness is what the IDF has taken them apart. So they've been defeated tactically in the battlefield. The good news is we keep talking about a weak Lebanese National Army. That's quite true. But they'll be very effective, I think, as peacekeepers if the withdrawal behind the Litani River takes place. I think it will. I think this is a real triumph for U.S. and French diplomacy. And one can only hope now that that will allow Hamas to feel even more isolated and perhaps bring a stop to that fight. The economic reconstruction, the money ought to come out of the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Gulf Coast states. There shouldn't be a U.S. responsibility to rebuild these devastated areas. But I think our diplomacy has been a major factor in bringing the fighting to a stop.
I want to bring in Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former Arab-Israeli negotiator. Aaron, let's talk about that. The diplomacy, the effect of diplomacy as someone who has served as an advisor in these kinds of negotiations. What do you make of this apparent deal?
My experience, and General McCaffrey, I think, has said a lot of wisdom there. My experience in Arab-Israeli negotiations is, first of all, they only have two speeds, slow and slower. And number two, when they do work, they work because there is real urgency. That is to say, the incentives for reaching a deal, in this case on the part of Israel and Hezbollah, are much more compelling than the disincentives of allowing the status quo to pertain. Israelis have done an enormous amount of damage to Hezbollah's financial reserves, its gold deposits, its command and control. Yesterday, the day before, they went after the last senior commander, Mohammed Haider, in Beirut. who's in charge of operations. So there's urgency there. On the Israeli side, I think there's also urgency. 70,000 Israelis have been uprooted from the northern border towns and kibbutzim. That's number one. Israel, as you know, is a small standing army. It relies mainly on reserves, and they've been at war now. Reserve duty has been extended. And frankly, for an Israeli prime minister for whom politics is everything and staying in power is everything, this is a lot easier deal to do than Gaza. With Gaza, it's Palestinians, it's hostages, it's Israeli withdrawal, it's the return of large numbers of Palestinian prisoners who've either been convicted or charged with killing Israelis. So a lot of urgency. And I suspect, even though nobody ever lost money betting against Arab-Israeli peace agreements, this one may take a little while longer today or tomorrow. This one, I think, will be set into motion. Whether it will endure, another matter.
I mean, and David, this is also a reaffirmation, is it not, of Netanyahu's policy in the state, I'm sorry, Aaron, of not only Netanyahu's policy, but the state of Israel's policy on how to react after the 7th of October, and what they have done in Lebanon to Hezbollah is also probably one of the main motivating factors for Hezbollah to be willing to take this ceasefire.
No doubt. And I guess the core question would be for the diplomats is whether or not Israeli escalation dominance in in Gaza, in Lebanon, and even with Iran will lead over the next several months to de-escalation. You know, the president-elect here may well prove to be a very lucky man when it comes to this region, because he's inheriting these three conflicts at a time when the parties, frankly, have more reason to de-escalate than to escalate. And a lot of that, frankly, it's hard for many to admit, is a consequence of Israeli military escalation and dominance, clearly in Lebanon and also in Gaza, although the frightening loss of life among Palestinians, the suffering of the hostages and their families makes this also an acute humanitarian issue as well.